Welcome to lecture 3, which is the second part of this introduction to the cognitive behavioral model. Last time we talked about behaviorism, evolutionary or Darwinian psychiatry, and did a brief overview of the nervous system. Today we are going to talk about sort of bringing it all together, how modern psychology understands thoughts, feelings, and behavior through the lens of talking about emotions. Whoops. That is for class. Okay. So we're going to differentiate integrative from unidimensional explanatory models of psychopathology. And then using a modern integrative model, we are going to talk about the influences on the experience of emotion and individual differences in the experience of emotion and risk for emotional disorders. And then that will kind of transition into an introduction to the cognitive behavioral model. This is the emotion wheel, by the way. It's a color-coded diagram of all of the different emotions and sub-emotions that you might feel or that we might talk about in this class. Okay, so unidimensional models are like the ones that we talked about when we talked about the history of our understanding of psychology from ancient Greek medicine until the 19th century. These are models that, in general, explain psychopathology in terms of a single cause. So for example, behaviorism, the single cause that behaviorists used to explain psychopathology was that environmental contingencies, so reinforcement or punishment in the environment, shaped an individual's behavior in a way that turned out to be deviant, distressing, dysfunctional, or dangerous. So as we talked about in the last lecture, behaviorism actually is a pretty good explanatory model for a lot of disorders, including especially specific phobias. Also things like substance abuse disorders, most of the anxiety disorders. Behaviorism really explains a lot. But as I hope you'll see after today's lecture, single theory can't really explain every individual difference that we've observed in psychopathology. In the strength of emotional experiences, the valence of emotional experiences, so whether an individual tends to feel more positive or more negative emotions relative to other individuals, the stability of emotional experience, so how much a person's emotions fluctuate throughout the course of the day or in response to events, or how susceptible they are to conditioning of emotion, so how quickly and lastingly they form conditioned associations between formerly neutral stimuli that now generate an emotional response. So some things that can't be explained by any of the models that we talked about previously. So behaviorism is based on having natural emotional responses to certain stimuli that naturally trigger them. But behaviorism alone doesn't explain where those unconditioned responses, i.e. emotions, actually come from. It can't explain why two individuals in the same situation, in the same environment with the same contingencies might acquire different conditioned associations or different operant behaviors. Behaviorism isn't great at explaining some symptoms of psychopathology, especially things like psychosis, mania, or suicidal behavior and ideation. Although in some cases, suicidal behavior is reinforced by the environment. But behaviorism especially is not great at explaining severe mental illness like psychosis and mania. So how is psychosis reinforced by the environment? It's not. And how behaviorism doesn't explain, especially how conscious thought influences behavior and emotion. And when you're treating human beings, you really need to take that into account, because even if behaviorism totally explained everything, you still have to explain that to a patient sitting in front of you and work with their value system, their beliefs, their life experiences, their expectations. So the cognitive behavioral model does a better job of explaining all of this. Okay, so the focus of today's lecture is going to be on individual differences in emotional experience and how that helps to explain psychopathology from a multidimensional point of view. But first, we're going to talk about how psychologists define emotion. So in behaviorism, when we talk about conditioned or unconditioned responses, those responses are emotions. So dogs' emotional lives are a little bit different from ours, but when a dog hears a conditioned stimulus that it associates with food, it has emotions that we might recognize as happy, excited. Hunger isn't an emotion, it's a physiological state, but hunger isn't exactly the response that is being triggered by the stimulus. It's actually more like expectation and preparation to eat, which is also not an emotional response, but it has an emotional valence. The conditioned emotion, the response to stimuli paired with food for dogs is excitement. So by definition, emotions are short-term experiences, and they're usually triggered by or directed towards a specific event. This is in contrast with concepts like mood and affect. Mood is sort of a broader, longer-lasting state. Mood has more to do with how likely or unlikely you are to have certain emotional reactions over a period of time. So if you're having depressed mood, it means that compared to your baseline, you're less likely to have positive emotions and more likely to have negative emotions. Doesn't mean that you can't have positive emotions ever. Mood and emotions are separate, but mood influences the likelihood of certain emotions because emotions are usually congruent with your mood. So there are three pieces to emotions when we think about like what actually is an emotion. First, emotions are physiological responses. So they involve chemical changes in our bodies and changes in our nervous system. So our heart rate changes, our breathing rate changes, our perspiration rate changes. Depending on the emotion, the rate of digestion might speed up or slow down. Often the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system takes over when we're having an emotional response. If it's a negative emotion like stress or fear, the sympathetic nervous system would take over. Emotions also involve thought for humans because we're conscious. We experience this physiological state and we interpret it in some way. We tell ourselves a story, we explain it to ourselves. So when you're really angry, what happens first is your nervous system registers that a stimulus in your environment provoked anger, and it causes physiological changes that your conscious mind notices and, paired with the stimulus that triggered them, interprets as anger. The last piece of an emotion is an action tendency. So emotions motivate behavior. When you're angry, your action tendency is to approach in an aggressive way, to attack. When you're afraid, your action tendency is to run away. When you're disgusted, your action tendency is also to avoid, but not necessarily to put physical distance between yourself and the disgust elicitor. Because disgust is an emotion that really has to do with eating, the avoidance that comes with disgust is usually just emotion or avoidance of touching or eating something. So emotions are physiological responses that we interpret cognitively and that inspire or motivate a behavioral action. Psychopathology, as we've talked about, involves prolonged alterations in an individual's emotional experience. So in the types of emotions they are more likely to have, or their emotional expression, so the way that they express their emotions. So emotions are extremely relevant to psychopathology. Obviously, most forms of psychopathology involve alterations in emotion in some way or another. But emotional disturbances, changes in emotional experience is kind of the core of the two most common forms of psychopathology globally and in the United States. Anxiety and depression are both emotional disorders. They're both characterized by altered emotional states. Anxiety is characterized by excessive and inappropriate fear and apprehension and anxiety. Depression is caused by excessive and inappropriate negative affect, sadness, low mood, and other negative emotions like irritability, disgust. Okay, so as I said, emotions are physiological reactions. What that means is that when we're feeling an emotion, a region in our brain, our central nervous system, is activated. And when a region in our brain is activated, what that really means is that the neurons in that area are firing and they're releasing their neurotransmitter, which has a downstream effect on whatever other region of the central nervous system or the body those neurotransmitters are signaling to. So when we feel emotions, it's our body producing certain hormones or certain neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters having an effect on another part of the nervous system or on the body via the peripheral nervous system, which controls our autonomic functions and our conscious goal-directed movement. Oh, wow, that's a weird slide. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we're going to touch on two themes related to emotions today. Quickly, we're going to go back to Darwinian medicine, like we talked about last time, and ask, why do we even have emotions? Like, why would the ability to have emotions be conserved? Why did it benefit our species for survival or reproduction in our environment of evolutionary adaptation? And then for the bulk of the lecture, we're going to focus on why individuals differ in their emotional experience. So why some people have psychopathology where they have distressing, deviant, or dysfunctional emotional experiences, and why other people are less vulnerable to those emotional alterations. So the integrative approach to emotions that we're going to take in this lecture is going to take into account the reciprocal interactions, so the bidirectional causal relationships between biology, psychology, and environment. And in this case, biology is going to be mostly defined as genes, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides. Psychology is going to be defined as a pretty broad construct that's made up of our personality, our capacity for complex thought and reflection, our beliefs, and all of the learned associations and learned behaviors that we've acquired over our lifetimes. And personality, thoughts, belief, associations, conditioning, it's influenced by biology. It's also influenced by our environment. So our environment encompasses the culture that we grow up in, the society that we're exposed to, our upbringing, so the way that our parents and people close to us treated us when we were growing up, and our life experiences, which is basically the source of all of the learned associations and behaviors we have that makes up the psychological component of this. And then all of this interacts with the environment or with our biology in ways that we'll talk about in the next couple slides. Okay, but first, from the Darwinian medicine perspective, why do we even have emotions in the first place? Why do they benefit us? Oh man, the animations got messed up. Okay, well, so first of all, how do we even know that emotions are an evolved adaptation? Well, if a trait or a behavior is universal to a species, if every member of a species in every population, regardless of the specific environment that they're in, and regardless of any like unusual or abnormal ways for their species that they're brought up, if they express that trait or behavior universally, it means that it is probably an evolutionarily conserved trait, because it's not a product of any specific environment if it occurs across every environment in which a species is found and in novel environments to that species. So we know from history and literature and from cultural anthropology and interactions with, especially in the past, because there are not that many hunter-gatherer tribes who aren't exposed to society anymore. But we know from interactions with groups like that before they had a lot of contact with other parts of society, that every human culture, people living in every human culture, have 6 basic emotions. So going left to right across these 3 rows, the 6 basic emotions that all humans experience, express, and recognize in other people are fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, anger, and disgust. These emotions are universal. Every person has them, and we don't need to be taught them. Infants don't express these emotions, but they don't have to be like sat down and specifically told, this is what disgust is, this is what your face looks like when you're feeling disgusted. It's a natural action tendency that comes with that emotion. Facial expressions are an example of an emotional action tendency. So if something is universal, it must have been present in a common ancestor, which means it's evolutionarily conserved. And if a behavior is evolutionarily conserved, we infer that it must have benefited survival or reproduction of a species at some point in their environment of evolutionary adaptation. So why were emotions conserved for people? Okay, well, first of all, humans are not the only species that has emotion. Basically, all mammalian species have some way of communicating something about their internal state and their reactions to their environment that other members of their species understand. But we're going to focus on human emotion. And probably the main reason that emotion is beneficial to the human species is that we live in groups and we really rely on each other for survival. So emotions are a very quick and intuitive way of communicating, and they promote cooperation between members of our species. So for example, say that you're a hunter-gatherer and you're out hunting or gathering with your friend who is wearing a suit and glasses for some reason. And you look over and you see this expression on his face. Without him having to say anything, without him having to tell you or explain, you know immediately that you're in danger. He didn't have to do anything besides have an emotional reaction, and he communicated something about the environment to you with his emotional reaction. And ancestors who had an ability to recognize that emotional response in others benefited in a survival or reproductive sense. In this case, we would benefit from being able to recognize fear in other people because it clues us in that there's something dangerous in the environment. People who could communicate fear, who had this instinctive emotional expression of fear, probably also had greater reproductive success because it helped their family members to survive. Similarly, emotions are important for us to learn. So humans learn from direct experience. That's how operant learning and conditioning happen. But we also learn from observing other people. We learn from what's called modeling. So if you're a toddler and you're following your mom around while she's gathering in the bushes, and she sees you start to put a berry or a stick in your mouth and makes that face, you know, without having to put it in your mouth and experience it, that it's not something you should eat. She's communicating to you that it's not food, it's not healthy, it's not good for you, just with her face, without even meaning to. She just had an instinctive emotional reaction. In terms of cooperation, humans live in groups and we have to be able to read each other and understand our social environment and our social world. So if you are a hunter-gatherer and you need to ask someone in your group to do you a really big favor, which of these two people would you ask? People who could recognize that you should probably ask the guy who's smiling at you to do you a favor instead of the person who seems to be angry at you did better in their social environment. They were better at getting people to do them favors, and that benefited their survival or their reproduction. So emotions were conserved because they benefited people. So that's really the only question that Darwinian medicine answers. Why do we have the capacity for emotions? But it doesn't really get at why different individuals have different emotional experiences. And that is where biology, psychology, and the environment and their reciprocal interactions come in. So starting with biology, the intensity and the frequency of our emotions and all of those physiological changes that have to happen in order for us to experience emotions in our bodies, all of that is influenced by our genes. Our genes are the building blocks for our bodies. Our genes are code for protein that builds the actual physical structures of our bodies that give us a place to live and an ability to interact with the world. But as you probably know, everyone's genes are a little bit different. So genotype is a term for the set of genes that you as an individual have. And for many genes that code for proteins, there are different varieties, different variants of those genes that all function, but that all work a little bit differently. So allele is a term for a variant of a gene. You would say that there's 3 different alleles of a gene, and each of those alleles does the same basic thing, but a little differently. Phenotype is a term for the observable expression of your genotype. So if you have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, that's your genotype, but your secondary sex characteristics that those chromosomes influence as you develop, that's your phenotype. So as we know, we get our genes from our parents, and during sexual reproduction, each parent contributes a sperm cell or an egg cell known as gametes, and each gamete contains half of that parent's chromosomes. Each chromosome divides in half when a gamete is produced. When a fetus is produced, when a sperm cell and an egg cell get together, those genes are combined. So on average, people have about half of their genes from their mom and half from their dad. So because our reproduction is sexual and we need to be able to survive into adulthood and then convince someone to have sex with us in order to successfully reproduce, and depending on our species model of child rearing, just the female or both parents, in the case of humans, have to cooperate and continue to survive and protect their offspring long enough for it to become sexually mature and reproduce. So organisms who are successful at doing that, because of their phenotype, because of the characteristics that their genes give them, that help them to survive and reproduce, those successful genes are more likely to be present in subsequent generations. And all of us are carrying the genes of our most successful ancestors. So there are high-risk genes for psychopathology, and we know that psychopathology runs in families. We inherit the genes from our parents that influence our tendency to have emotional responses. Okay, so psychopathology is heritable. There are genetic traits that increase someone's risk for psychopathology, including psychopathology like anxiety and depression that's especially characterized by unusual emotional experiences. And we know from twin and adoption studies, which we'll talk about in a couple lectures from now, that this heritability, this tendency of traits related to psychopathology to run in families, is genetic. It's not solely caused by the fact that the people who give us their genes also tend to be the ones who raise us. We know this from looking at studies of identical twins who share 100% of their genes and who are more similar on most traits related to psychopathology than siblings or fraternal twins who only share 50% of their genes. And we also know this from adoption studies where children who are raised by adoptive parents share more psychopathology related traits with their biological parents than they do with their adoptive parents. So although our upbringing and our childhood environment matters a lot, our genes are the starting point for what psychopathology we are at risk for and kind of what psychopathology we're even physically capable of expressing. So in the next couple slides, we're going to talk about high-risk genes or high-risk alleles, which are variants of genes, alleles, that are linked to psychopathological traits. But before that, it is also true that the environment has a really big influence on the expression and the experience of psychopathology. So one of the biggest risk factors for psychopathology, independently of genes, is uncontrollable stress during childhood. This is also known as adverse childhood experiences, childhood adversity. And the mechanism for this is that chronic stress, one of the mechanisms, the biological mechanism, is that chronic stress actually permanently changes the body. It alters the sensitivity of the sympathetic nervous system. Chronic stress makes the acute stress response, the response that we have to stressors in the environment, stronger, it makes it longer lasting, and it makes it easier to trigger. And this is known as sensitization. So the disorders that we'll talk about in this class that are most strongly related to environmental risk factors like childhood adversity are anxiety, depression, substance use, eating disorders, insomnia. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, that should be on there too. Attachment disorders, some personality disorders. With twin studies and adoption studies, we can actually start to break down the percentage of risk that is accounted for by genes and the percentage of risk that's accounted for by the environment. Disorders like anxiety and depression, substance use, eating disorders, insomnia, PTSD, there's a strong environmental component to these disorders independent of genetics. So some of the most potent sources of childhood adversity are child maltreatment, so parental abuse and neglect, but other sources of stress during childhood that can increase risk for psychopathology, although not as robustly as child abuse, are things like having a parent who was ill or a parent who died, growing up in a violent neighborhood or witnessing a lot of violence as a child, and experiencing an illness as a child. Okay. But of course, as I kind of already said, genes and the environment interact. Although we can separate genetic contributions and environmental contributions through research studies, in reality, we can't separate the contribution of genes and the environment to psychopathology for any single individual. In most cases, our parents give us the genes and also shape our childhood environment that influences our risk for psychopathology. So for example, parents who have genetic risk for alcoholism and have the trait, who have the alcoholic phenotype, where they actually abuse alcohol and have all of the attendant behaviors, raising a child as an alcoholic leads to higher rates of child maltreatment or just stress on the child from seeing their parent being ill or from the social and economic consequences of substance abuse. So if that child then grows up to have substance abuse themselves, for an individual, it's impossible to disentangle how much of their outcome has to do with their genetic risk factors and how much of their outcome has to do with their life experiences growing up with an alcoholic parent. But we can make this determination on average, and we know that both of these things contribute. So when we talk about high-risk genes, risky alleles, a lot of the actual risk present for developing psychopathology really depends on the environment. A person can have high-risk alleles, but if they happen to find themselves in the right environment, those high-risk alleles will never lead to psychopathology because the environment never triggers that. So for class, I had you guys read an article about the Compt gene. This is a gene that codes for an enzyme. And what enzymes do is they help to break down neurotransmitters after they've been used up. So once a neuron signals and releases its neurotransmitter, not all of the neurotransmitters bind to receptors. And eventually enzymes have to come in and clear them out of the synapse to make room for more signaling to happen in the future. The Compt gene codes for enzymes that either work really fast at breaking down a specific neurotransmitter, dopamine, in a specific area, the prefrontal cortex, or really slowly. So people who have slow breakdown of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, what that does for them is that under normal conditions, when they're allowed to have all the time in the world to solve problems, they're on average better at solving problems. They have better cognitive performance overall, but their performance is worse under stress. And the reason for this, the reason probably that their cognitive performance is better, is that the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that kind of allows us to have conscious control over every other part of our brain. It helps us concentrate, it helps us solve problems, it helps us regulate our emotions, and it helps us be less influenced by our emotions. So sort of tune out emotional contributions to our thinking. And in the prefrontal cortex, dopamine activates the brain regions that are involved in doing this. So when dopamine breaks down more slowly, it means that there's more of it available in the synapse to do its job. So people with slow dopamine breakdown, basically you can think of it as they have prefrontal cortexes that work better under normal conditions. But under stress, when you need to respond really fast to changing environments and your brain needs to be kind of flexible and quick and shift between different responses to the environment, so different instances of neural firing into the prefrontal cortex from different areas to different areas, fast breakdown really benefits performance. So essentially, people with the slow breakdown, with 2 copies of the allele for the slow breakdown, so they got one from their mom and one from their dad, that break down dopamine slowly, this genotype has been called the Worrier Genotype. These are people who are prone to anxiety and not handling stress well. People who have 2 copies of the fast breakdown gene have what's called the Worrier Genotype. I'm from the East Coast, so I say those 2 things the same way. Apparently other accents pronounce them differently. But people with 2 copies, the Worrier phenotype, perform really well under stress, but they might not be as suited to jobs that require a lot of like focus and deliberate thinking. And of course, there are people who have intermediate phenotypes. So there's people who have 1 copy of the slow breakdown gene and 1 copy of the fast breakdown gene. And actually those people are more common because if your mom and dad both have 1 copy of each, you have a 50% chance of getting, you have a 50% chance of also having 1 copy of each, and only a 25% chance of having either the Worrier or the Worrier genotype. If one of your parents has only 1 kind and one of your parents has only the other kind, you will always get both. So going back to the last lecture, we talked about evolutionary trade-offs. The reason why both of these variants persisted in human populations is probably that humans live in groups. And so having people with different types of skills and different capabilities benefited the group as a whole. So if you think about hunter-gatherers again, people with the Worrier, the fast breakdown genotype, they were really brave. They were really willing to take risks. They were really good under pressure. So these might be the people who went foraging like on the furthest reaches of the territory, or who went hunting like the biggest game. Whereas people with the Worrier phenotype were better at thinking ahead, thinking about the future, planning, creating stores for the winter, learning about herbal medicine, treating disease. Both of these types of people had a place in society. But in modern society, people have a lot more choices and a lot more agency over what kind of environment they want to select into. The jobs that we have access to are not just hunter or gatherer. There's a lot of things that we can do. So in modern society, people who have the Worrier phenotype have the option often to kind of self-select into low pressure environments where they can use their brains and have ingenious ideas and make big plans and not have to deal with a lot of stress. Whereas warriors, they can avoid environments where they have to just like sit still and think a lot and be bored. They can select into fast-paced, exciting, maybe dangerous jobs. The problem comes in when people over-specialize, and when someone who's a warrior doesn't ever learn how to function under pressure. Pressure is kind of inevitable. So when that pressure eventually comes up, they're liable to break down and experience anxiety, depression. Whereas warriors, similarly, when they're forced into a situation where they actually have to like focus and concentrate and come up with solutions to problems, if they haven't chosen to expose themselves to that situation before, they don't have the skill. So changes in the environment outside of our control can lead to psychopathology via an environmental mismatch between our phenotype and the environment that we find ourselves in. And the ability to specialize and select your own environment can actually make this worse. Because when something happens outside of your control and you've selected into an environment that makes you maximally comfortable, once you're forced out of your comfort zone, it really impairs your functioning. And one possible example of this, it has not been studied, so we actually don't know what the percentage of the Worrier gene is for physicians. But what's definitely true is that physicians have some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression in the population. And one possible reason for this is that the traits that it takes to succeed academically throughout high school and college, get yourself into medical school, get really great grades in medical school and match into a really good residency, are not necessarily the same traits that it takes to succeed in a really high pressure, high stakes, life or death environment. So in fields like clinical medicine, you might have a lot of people who got where they were, who did well academically because they function well in low pressure environments where they can just sort of think everything through, but then who find themselves in really high pressure environments where they have to make very fast decisions. And that leads to a lot of psychological distress. We'll revisit this when we talk about PTSD, but there is some interesting evidence that people with the Worrier genotype, so the slow breakdown genotype, may be more likely to develop PTSD after experiencing an uncontrollable trauma, like being mugged or witnessing violence. Another really interesting study of soldiers from the Iraq War actually found that either extreme phenotype was problematic. They were more likely to develop PTSD in the presence of trauma. And the thinking on this is that, as we'll talk about in the PTSD lecture, processing a traumatic event actually requires being able to change your conscious, sort of slow, logical, rational beliefs and sort of accommodate the trauma and whatever new evidence it brings that might challenge your existing beliefs, but also the ability to process the emotions that come with the trauma and to do both of those things. So heterozygosity is not the right word, sorry. Heterozygosity is different. I don't think it's even a word. Anyway, in this particular study of soldiers who were exposed to trauma during war, what was found was that people who had one copy of the slow breakdown gene and one copy of the fast breakdown gene were less likely to develop PTSD. And the authors concluded that that might be because having both actually is kind of the best of both worlds. It means that you're able to do the slow thinking, but also use your emotions to aid in your cognitive process so that they're not in competition like they might be if you have an extreme phenotype. And this kind of brings us to a very important concept that we're going to revisit a ton, known as the diathesis stress model. And this model, it basically suggests that for most cases of psychopathology, we can't identify a single cause. Neither someone's risk alleles nor their environment would be enough on their own to cause that psychopathology. But someone with the right, or I guess in this case, wrong genotype in the wrong environment, those two things will come together to promote psychopathology. So for example, someone with a strong worrier phenotype who's forced into a situation where they have to make life or death decisions, or someone with a strong worrier phenotype who's forced into an environment where they have to have a lot of self-control and manage their emotions. An example of a stress diathesis relationship is actually another allele that also relates to the monoamine system, but a different neurotransmitter. So this is a gene that encodes for, basically it codes for a protein that helps to transport serotonin around the brain. As we talked about, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is really involved in mood regulation. So problems with serotonin functioning are thought to be a pretty major risk factor for developing depression. There's two versions of the serotonin transporter gene. The long version means that your brain is very good at regulating serotonin functioning, and it's good at getting serotonin quickly to where it needs to be in your brain. The short version of the allele is less efficient at transporting serotonin. So it means that serotonin doesn't always get to where it's supposed to go, or it doesn't move around your brain as fast as it should. Another important concept is childhood maltreatment. So as we talked about, childhood maltreatment is the most potent form of childhood adversity in terms of risk for psychopathology. So physical, sexual, or emotional abuse or child neglect is one of the biggest predictors of having psychopathology as an adult. And in the case of depression, childhood maltreatment is responsible for roughly a 50% increase in your risk for getting depression as an adult. But the interesting thing is that that's not true for everyone. Having two copies of the long serotonin transporter allele seems to be protective against developing depression because of maltreatment. So what this figure is showing is a statistical interaction where basically the relationship between maltreatment and probability of having depression is different for people with different genotypes. For people with two copies of the long serotonin transporter allele, there's really no relationship. Someone with two copies of the long transporter allele is almost just as likely to have depression if they were severely maltreated as a child as someone with two copies of the long allele who experienced no maltreatment at all. That's not true for people with one or two copies of the short allele. For people with two copies of the short allele, there's a strong relationship between the likelihood of developing depression and whether they were maltreated as a child. And people with two copies of the short allele are more likely than anyone else to develop depression in the presence of child abuse. For them, the risk is doubled. For people with one copy of the short allele and one copy of the long allele, these are the people for whom there's actually a 50% increase in risk. So this is an example of a gene, in this case, the short or long serotonin transporter allele, by environment, in this case, childhood maltreatment interaction. The effect of the environment on psychopathology depends on the person's genotype. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the relationship between environment and biology in influencing risk for psychopathology. And don't worry too much about memorizing all of these details. We will revisit all of these themes when we talk about the actual symptom disorders. This is just kind of a broad introduction so that when we come back to these themes and topics, they'll be familiar to you. Okay, so now let's take a step back and start talking about more conscious, direct experiences of emotion. So although emotions themselves are universal, every human population, every culture has the same basic 6 emotions. The culture that we grow up in influences and does sometimes determine what situations trigger emotions, and also how we express emotions, who expresses emotions, and how we experience emotions cognitively, how we describe our emotions to ourselves. So an example of culture influencing emotion has to do with sushi. So like I mentioned earlier, the emotion that's most associated with inappropriate, spoiled, or dangerous food is disgust. And until about 1970, if you showed sushi to an American, it would elicit disgust. The idea of eating raw fish to someone in 1965 would probably seem really revolting, unless they were I don't know, in San Francisco or on the coast somewhere. Eating raw fish was just not part of the American culture, not part of the diet. And so people would have reacted to this with disgust, whereas now probably most of us have had sushi before and like it. It's a part of our diet now, so we no longer have that emotional reaction to it. Our culture has basically determined that something that once would have elicited disgust no longer does. Now, it, for most people, probably elicits positive emotions. Another example is women wearing pants. So most of us don't really think anything of this now, but in the late 1800s, women wearing pants was actually a very provocative political statement. And so seeing a woman in bloomers would have elicited anger for some people. Culture determines what we see as appropriate or inappropriate behavior, and therefore what behaviors trigger emotional responses like anger. One that's a little bit more timely is seeing somebody on like the bus or the subway, or I guess sitting behind you in class, coughing and sneezing. Before 2020, that might have elicited maybe like mild annoyance or just no emotional reaction at all. But now, given our current cultural context, something like that could actually elicit a fear response because the meaning of it has changed according to our culture and our society. And then lastly, all of those were examples of emotional experience being influenced by culture determining whether a stimulus triggered a certain emotion or not. But culture also influences how we express emotions to other people. So an example of this is jazz funerals in New Orleans. At a jazz funeral, it's socially appropriate to express positive emotions like joy, as well as sadness. Whereas at other types of funerals in other cultural contexts, expressing joy and happiness at a funeral would probably be seen as inappropriate and people wouldn't do it. So culture influences and sometimes determines which emotions we experience in response to stimuli and how we express our emotions to ourselves and other people. So cultural differences in emotional expression, yes, it's expression to other people because emotions have a communicative function, but cultural differences can actually also determine how we explain our own emotions to ourselves. So an example of this is somatic symptoms, which are basically when someone experiences emotional pain, negative emotions, as physical. So, for example, having a headache, being nauseous, or having like muscle pain without any physical cause. The cause is emotional distress. So somatic symptoms of depression, meeting criteria for depression and also having a lot of unexplained physical symptoms is really common in a lot of parts of the world, like Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, more common in those regions compared to the US and Europe. This is actually because in the United States and Europe, we have a cultural language for explaining emotional pain to ourselves. We've kind of been taught about depression and shown models of depression in media, maybe by our families, maybe in classes like this. So when we have depression symptoms, we recognize those physiological reactions going on in our body and we label them as this is sadness, this is emotional pain, this is self-loathing. In countries and cultures where people don't have that type of emotional vocabulary, those same emotional experiences might be felt physically as pain instead of cognitively as sadness. And this is less and less true. So basically in all of those regions, Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, whether people experience depression as somatic symptoms or psychological pain now has more to do with their like level of education and their exposure to Western culture. And the same is true in the United States. So people who are more educated and have what we would call more medical literacy, according to like a Western model, are more likely to experience depression cognitively as opposed to physically. This is also true of kids. Kids don't have the same emotional vocabulary and the same ability to recognize and label emotions that adults do because it is something that we have to learn. We don't have to learn how to feel emotions, but we have to learn how to recognize and regulate them. So kids are more likely to experience depression and anxiety as somatic symptoms than adults. So in the United States, gender and specifically gender roles also might influence what types of emotions we experience or how we kind of express and explain our emotional pain to ourselves. What this bottom figure is showing is that there are really big gender differences in how common, in this case, depression is between men and women starting around puberty. And there's tons of theories about why this is. We may talk about it during the depression lectures. But one theory that there's some evidence behind is that from a really early age, girls and then women are more encouraged to talk about their feelings, to share their feelings, to be vulnerable. Society allows that more for women. And it's not necessarily a great thing because part of this is also that society encourages women to engage in a cognitive process called rumination that we'll talk about more in the depression lecture that actually kind of involves like dwelling on negative affect and processing it in a way that doesn't really help us resolve it. But women are more likely to do that because society has conditioned all of us to be more comfortable with women expressing emotions and expressing vulnerability. And for men to feel uncomfortable expressing emotions to themselves, but also for society, other people, to have negative reactions to men's emotional expressions. So men are more encouraged to suppress their emotions, and often that comes out in other ways. So through self-medicating with substances, or potentially through violent or criminal behavior. This might help to explain why men are more likely to commit crimes and women are more likely to have anxiety and depression. Society teaches us from a very early age what's an appropriate way to act based on our gender. And a big component of that is the types of emotions we express and the way that we express our emotions. Okay, so this is getting into one of the readings. You read about how use of smartphones can be reinforced as an operant behavior, but emotional responses to novel stimuli can also be learned through associative conditioning. So obviously we didn't have phones in our evolutionary environment, but what was really important to our evolutionary ancestors was the ability to form social relationships. So for people, positive social feedback and being liked and being appreciated by other humans is an extremely strong positive stimulus, whereas social rejection is a really powerful negative stimulus. These are unconditioned stimuli that elicit strong emotional reactions. So smartphones, which are primarily communication devices, whether we use it for texting or social media, and social media symbols have kind of come for many of us to take on the valence of these social interactions. So posting something and getting likes creates positive feelings, even though that like thumbs up on Facebook or that heart on Instagram and Twitter, it doesn't mean anything outside of the social context. We have the same emotional response to those symbols that we do to the actual social interactions that they're standing in for. And these can be positive emotional reactions, but also negative emotional reactions. So these symbols that have no intrinsic meaning, but have become conditioned stimuli for social interactions, have really strong influences on our mood. And also, as the Hayes article talked about, on our behavior and our use of smartphones. So that's an example of associative learning, but emotions are also the key ingredient in developing learned behaviors in operant conditioning. So environmental reinforcement in the form of rewards or punishments is really just the environment interacting with and influencing our emotions. And we engage in operant intentional behaviors in an effort to either escape punishment or gain a reward in order to enhance our own emotions. Most of our behaviors are aimed at improving our emotional state in some way, in escaping from negative affect or approaching positive affect. Another type of learning that is very relevant to depression is learned helplessness. So in humans, learned helplessness arises when someone experiences uncontrollable stress and adversity. When bad things keep happening to them, and through all of their efforts and everything they do to try to make it better for themselves, they keep failing. These repeated failures over time, these efforts to escape from negative affect that are completely unrewarded by the environment, lead to feelings of hopelessness and apathetic behavior. Over time, if you learn that nothing you do can improve your situation, you're going to stop trying. And you're going to learn that behavior to try to get out of a negative situation isn't going to be helpful. So you'll stop engaging in that behavior. This video is just a really quick overview of the scientific experiments in animals that kind of underlie this human model of depression.
What is learned helplessness? Well, in India, when elephant trainers catch a baby elephant, they tie its legs with a rope to a post. And this baby elephant will struggle for days trying to break free, and it eventually gives up when it learns that it's useless. When it grows up, these trainers keep it tied using the same rope. And even though it's now strong enough to break free and escape, the elephant stands around waiting for the trainers because it's learned that it's meaningless. This elephant has developed what's known as learned helplessness. And this is the fact that despite having the power to change its situation, it's learned to feel helpless instead because of the past. It was identified by a scientist in the 1960s who do the same thing by shocking dogs. Highly unethical, of course. But what does this have to do with us? Well, in your life, you may have experienced a crushing defeat and learned that there's just no way to overcome it. Maybe it's not the case. Maybe that's just a story you've told yourself. Just think about it. If the average person does poorly on a test, they'll say the professor was too hard a marker, whereas a clinically depressed person will blame themselves for not being smart enough. In both cases, the moment you give up, you've learned to be helpless of the situation. So in what ways has learned helplessness affected you?
Okay. So the other piece of reciprocal interactions between emotions and the environment, of course, comes in the form of operant conditioning and learned behaviors. So you read an article about one form of operant conditioning in the context of anxiety, where avoiding situations that provoke anxiety is highly reinforced because it helps you escape from a negative emotion, anxiety, but it, in the long run, causes anxiety symptoms to persist because it prevents new learning experiences from taking place, where you learn that the situations that you're avoiding actually don't cause as much distress as you think they will, or that the distress that it causes is manageable. We'll talk a lot about that in the anxiety lectures, but for now, another example of operant conditioning acting on intentional behaviors in the context of psychopathology is substance use. So substance use is a very difficult behavior to change, in part because using drugs and alcohol for people with substance use disorder is both positively and negatively reinforced. There's multiple types of reinforcement acting on the same behavior and making it more likely that it will continue. So of course, there's positive reinforcement. There's reward involved in using substances. The drugs that we abuse induce positive emotions. They make us feel good. And of course, behaviors paired with positive emotional experiences are more likely to be repeated. If you do something and it makes you feel great, you're more likely to do it again. But in addition to positive reinforcement, and in fact, taking over for positive reinforcement as our bodies develop tolerance and drugs no longer have the same emotional positive effect on us, negative reinforcement also comes into play when substances distract from or reduce the experience of negative emotions. And just like in the article that you read about anxiety, behaviors that are paired with relief from anxiety or sadness or any negative emotional state are also more likely to be repeated. And once someone is deep into an addiction, all of their drug taking is usually negatively reinforced, not even by escape from negative emotions, but escape from withdrawal. Okay. Last piece before I bring it back to cognitive behavioral therapy, but this is important because in addition to our behaviors being aimed at modifying our emotions through doing things that increase positive affect and reduce negative affect, we can also influence our emotions with our conscious thoughts. And one example of this is attribution of arousal. So arousal is just a term for like physical excitation. So like elevated heart rate, elevated respiration rate, feeling really like keyed up and on edge. This type of arousal, the physiological changes in our body, happens in both anxiety and excitement. So what we would consider a negative emotion and what we would consider a positive emotion, physiologically, they look similar. And so the way that we consciously label and interpret those physiological behaviors really determines what we actually end up feeling, whether we end up feeling anxious or whether we feel excited. And then that also influences the action tendencies associated with those emotions. So there's a few famous examples of what's known as misattribution of arousal, where people kind of mistakenly attribute their arousal to one stimulus when it's actually being caused by another, or when they mistakenly label one type of emotional arousal as a different type of emotional arousal. So one example of this is TV dating shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. As you probably know, those relationships often don't last very long after the show is over. And one reason for that is that some contestants genuinely do think that they're falling in love, but part of that might actually be them misattributing the stress, anxiety, and excitement that comes from being on TV, being in front of a camera, being in that very specific situation, to romantic attraction, to the arousal and excitement that would come with falling in love. And so when the cameras are gone and they're out of that stressful and exciting situation, that arousal goes away, and they sometimes realize that what they were feeling wasn't actually love and attraction. It was related to the TV show and not to the person. A scientific example of this comes from a famous study by Aaron and Dutton, where volunteers on a campus that for some reason had a huge gorge in the middle of it, maybe it was Cornell, Research volunteers approached subjects, just random students, and asked them out on dates. And the manipulation in the study was that half of the students were approached while they were crossing a bridge over a gorge, and half of them were approached before getting on the bridge on solid ground. And what Aaron and Dutton found was that students who were asked on a date while they were standing in the middle of this scary rickety bridge over a huge canyon were more likely to say yes to the date, and they were also more likely to follow up and call the number of the research volunteer afterwards. And so what these researchers hypothesized is that participants who were standing on the bridge were attributing the arousal that was coming from anxiety and fear of heights to excitement about the person who asked them out on a date. So the same phenomenon that we might be seeing in TV dating shows has been kind of demonstrated to happen by science. Okay, so what that suggests is that if our emotions are causing us problems, if we have psychopathology, we can consciously influence our present emotions and also our future emotions, how we'll feel the next time we encounter a similar situation, by actively reframing our thoughts. So as the video said, in the example of failing a test, it's natural to feel sad after failing at something, and most people would. But the way that we interpret that failure, so in the ABC model, which we'll talk about in the next couple of lectures, the failure would be the activating event, the adversity, the negative thing that happens or the situation that happens that triggers an emotional response. The belief system that we bring to it is what actually influences the feeling that we experience as a consequence and the behavior that we take away from that. So if your belief is that the world is unfair, everything is hard, you can't control your life, and bad things are going to happen to you, you might have thoughts like, I am stupid, I'm not good at school, I'm never going to be good at this professor is really unfair, they're not treating me well. If your belief system has more to do with having agency over the environment or having optimism about the future, you might think something like, I'll study more next time, I'll go to office hours, I'll ask for help. Or you might think like, I actually don't care that much about this class, like whatever, I just have to pass it. Either way, if you interpret the experience, the activating event, through that lens, it will influence your future emotional state because you'll be more likely to move on from the sadness faster. You'll be less likely to sort of dwell on it. And you'll also be more likely to engage in behavior that makes future failure less likely. So if you interpret the activating event as, this is just another example of why my life sucks and is unfair, or this is just proof that I'm stupid, that's not going to motivate you to try to change it. Could be an example of learned helplessness. If you interpret it as, oh, this means I didn't study hard enough, I should try harder next time, that interpretation is less likely to lead to lasting sadness, and it's more likely to lead to behavior that makes the activating event less likely to happen again. Okay, so to sum things up, we went through a lot today, but basically this is the takeaway. Emotions are one of the key ingredients in psychopathology, and they have a heritable biological basis in the body. Our genes are the blueprint for the physical structures that actually allow us to feel emotion. And people differ in the types of genes they have. Some of us just have more genetic risk for psychopathology than others. Some of us have genes that cause us to feel more negative emotions, to feel negative emotions in response to a wider range of stimuli, unconditioned stimuli, and to develop negative emotional responses to conditioned stimuli in the environment more readily and in a longer lasting way. All of those are genetic contributions to risk for psychopathology. But of course, the environment always has to interact with these genetic predispositions. If we have a predisposition towards easy fear conditioning, that won't influence our risk of psychopathology unless something happens to us that triggers an initial unconditioned fear response and allows us to develop a conditioned association. If we have 2 short copies of the serotonin transporter allele but don't experience childhood maltreatment, our risk for depression isn't elevated by our genotype. If we have the Worrier phenotype with slow breakdown of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, but never find ourselves in a life or death situation where we have to act quickly, these genetic risk factors won't on their own contribute to psychopathology. And this is known as the diathesis stress model, where there has to be both genetic diathesis and environmental stress to activate it. We also know that basic emotions, the 6 basic emotions, are universal to all humans, but the culture that we grow up in causes us to have culturally specific emotion elicitors. Things like our gender or our belief system about psychology and the way that we label our own emotional physiological experiences influence how we express and how we experience our emotions. Some of our emotions are conditioned responses to stimuli that didn't used to have any meaning, but that acquired meaning through repeated pairing with unconditioned stimuli. So some of our emotional responses are acquired through classical conditioning. And again, for some people, classical conditioning of negative emotions is kind of the trigger for psychopathology. And then lastly, our emotions are very strongly influenced by our conscious interpretations of our physiological reactions, which means that with training and conscious effort, we can interpret our emotions in a way that influences the likelihood of experiencing those same emotions in the future. And that is what cognitive behavioral therapy does. The cognitive behavioral model is a broad integrative approach to understanding and treating psychopathology, with an understanding that our biology interacts with our personality, beliefs, and prior learning history, which all interacts with our environment to influence our emotional experience and expression. And the first step in getting better when you're engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy for any psychopathology is understanding why, for you, the combination of your biology, your psychology, and your environment is leading to problematic emotional responses. Once a patient understands that, they're able to work with a therapist to take steps to change the behaviors and the cognitive interpretations of emotions and events, which in turn change their future emotions and their future events. Okay. I'm guessing that was more than an hour.